Hey there, it's Delta City Fox here. Thank you for joining me as I walk through the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois on this 19th day of October 2019. So today I'd like to discuss, compare, and contrast a dichotomy of being generous with your own resources versus being generous with someone else's resources. I'm approaching this comparison under the axiom that being generous with your own resources is a virtue, whereas being generous with other people's resources is not a virtue. And moreover, that being generous with other people's resources is especially dangerous because it is disguised as a virtue. So, when you are generous with your own resources, that can obviously come in many different forms. You can be generous with your own body by being an organ donor. You can be generous with your own life by enlisting in a fighting force to go and fight in a military conflict for a cause that you believe in. You can also be generous with your money by donating it to charity. I have a friend who allows a homeless man to come into her home and take a shower every once in a while. In doing so, she is being generous with her time, her privacy, and her water bill. So you are giving some of your resources away, but what are you getting in return? Well, most immediately, your body may release hits of dopamine, giving you a do-gooder's high. This, in theory, is a reward from an evolutionary standpoint for recognizing the societal covenant of mutual aid by helping out your fellow mankind. You may also get some good notoriety from those in your community who see you being generous. Likewise, you will score some direct reciprocity with the people who you are being generous with. And maybe you are gaining salvation in the afterlife by being a good person in the eyes of God. So, you give your resources and you get something in return. Now compare this to being generous with other people's resources. And to help demonstrate this, I'd like to share an anecdotal story. Several years ago, I was in law school. There was a guest speaker delivering a speech in the student commons where there was pizza and soft drinks being provided by the school for the student spectators. I was in between classes, and so I went and had a seat by the window in the student commons and had some pizza and a Diet Coke and listened to the speaker. After the speaker was finished, a homeless man knocked on the window next to me from outside of the school to get my attention. And he pointed at some of the leftover unfinished pizza. So I got up and got a few slices, put them on a plate, and brought them outside to the homeless man. He thanked me and began eating the pizza. So when I re-entered the law school, the security guard at the entrance asked me to go and see the supervising security guard in his office. When I went to see him, he told me that he had seen what I had done on camera. He said, "Thank you for giving the homeless man the pizza, but please don't do it again, because when that happens, it attracts a lot of homeless people to the law school." He then told me that what he does on occasion is to take a homeless person to the Subway restaurant next door to the law school and purchase a combo meal for the homeless person. He suggested that I do this alternative in the future should I want to help feed a homeless person. That raised a very interesting question to me. I was willing to give out the school's food, but would I likewise have been willing to spend my own money to feed this homeless man? And honestly, I don't believe I would have. So I was being generous with other people's property, but not with my own property. I was getting dopamine from my body for being generous, while at the same time I wasn't expending any of my own resources. It really struck me that being generous with someone else's resources isn't a virtue. And if you see someone who is advocating for the expenditure of someone else's resources, when he himself declines to support a cause or endeavor with his own resources, then it's necessary to be very skeptical about this person's motives, because he is getting dopamine or other benefits by supposedly being generous, all without expending any of his own resources. He is effectively getting something for nothing, and this detachment may and probably will cause him to malinvest your resources. Now, I live in the city of Chicago, in the state of Illinois, in the country of the United States. My federal government has a largely interventionist foreign policy, which often translates into the United States military being used as a foreign fighting force or as a foreign peacekeeping force. Furthermore, my government provides many social welfare benefits to American citizens, and it is the government that funds these through taxation. So imagine that the United States government, or any other government for that matter, wasn't there to be a middleman. If that were the case, then the onus would be on you to voluntarily provide your own resources for causes that you supported. So let's say that there were a genocide occurring in Iraq or Syria, and you wanted to stop it. The onus would be on you to enlist in a peacekeeping force to go over and stop the fighting, or you could donate a portion of your salary, or you could sell your car and donate the proceeds to this peacekeeping force. Likewise, let's say that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and you didn't like this. You wanted Afghanistan to be free from Soviet rule. You could enlist in a fighting force to go to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet invaders. You could also pay 10% of your salary to support this war effort. Additionally, you could use reason and evidence to attempt to persuade other people to voluntarily enlist in this peacekeeping force or fighting force, or to voluntarily donate their money to support this peacekeeping effort or war effort. Now, inevitably, if you were asking other people to expend their own resources, then you would be asked, "You are advocating that I volunteer my resources, but why should I listen to you? Have you volunteered your resources? If not, then why are you advocating that I do something that you yourself aren't willing to do?" Here in the United States, because we are so into foreign military interventionism, we have a lot of war hawks in our government. But most of these people are also chicken hawks. These are people who avoided adverse military service themselves, especially during the Vietnam War, but who then advocate for American foreign military interventionism. Now, these people lack credibility because when their generation's war came around, they avoided military service or got a job in the military that was not dangerous. But now, as older statesmen, they are not nearly as frugal when putting the lives of so many young Americans in harm's way by advocating for American military foreign interventionism. So, likewise, let's say that you believe that a certain social welfare program should be a universal right for everyone in your society, and you don't have the government as a middleman to fund this social welfare program through forced taxation. Then it would be necessary for you to expend your own resources to guarantee it. For example, let's say that you believe that people have an unalienable human right to housing. Would you be willing to donate your own money to ensure that everyone in your society has a home? Would you be willing to allow homeless people to live with you? Or maybe you believe that universal health care should be an unalienable universal human right. Well, then you could donate your own money to help pay for the health care of others who can't afford it. Or perhaps you could study to become a doctor and then provide your services for free, or at least provide your services for an under-market pay rate in order to ensure that everyone in your society has universal health care. So, would you expend your own resources? Maybe you would, and if so, then that's great, and it's virtuous because you are being generous with your own resources. Though, maybe you wouldn't. And if you would expend other people's resources but not your own, then it's not a virtue. Instead, it's disingenuous virtue signaling. With that, let's take a look at an interesting real-world example. Mr. Benedict Cumberbatch. He is a very successful actor from the United Kingdom, and he is currently worth around $30 million US. And at the time of this article, which we're about to delve into, he lived in Hampstead, which is a very upscale part of London, England. So, like many other celebrities, he has been an advocate for Syrian refugees. One of his advocacies has been lobbying the British government to accept Syrian refugees into the United Kingdom and to use government funding to resettle them. After the British government in 2015 agreed to accept 20,000 Syrian refugees over 5 years, Cumberbatch blasted them for not doing enough. However, Cumberbatch was not so generous with his own resources as he was asking the British government to be with other people's resources. So let's take a look at this article from the British newspaper, the Daily Mail. In the article, Cumberbatch claims that he and his wife were, quote, so committed to the cause that they considered housing refugees in their £2.7 million Hampstead home, but decided against it. Cumberbatch says, people were saying, you've got a home, why don't you house refugees? And we did look into it, but we had then a very new baby, maybe 4 or 5 months old. Maybe people had a point. I understand why some might think that I should be housing people instead of complaining about the government not doing it. But I was trying to raise awareness that we can do more as a society because I feel we are able to do more than just recover bodies, unquote. So despite Cumberbatch lobbying the British government to accept Syrian refugees into the country for resettlement, he didn't want the refugees housed in his home. He preferred that they be housed somewhere else. Okay, so then what Cumberbatch could have said is that while he wasn't willing to house refugees in his own home, that he would pay for the resettlement cost of additional refugees. He could have said to the British government, if you are willing to accept into the country additional refugees above and beyond the 20,000, then I will pay for the resettlement cost for the next 5 years of up to 10 more refugees, or 20 more refugees, or 100 refugees. But ultimately, concerning the resettlement of Syrian refugees in the United Kingdom, Cumberbatch preferred that it be financed at taxpayer expense instead of his own. Keep in mind that he is a multi-millionaire, and that it be done somewhere else other than his posh London home. So, not to single out Benedict Cumberbatch, I understand that he does contribute to charities, but when it comes to the plight of Syrian refugees and their resettlement in the United Kingdom, he was being generous with other people's resources using the government as a middleman, but was stingy with his own resources when he had a clear opportunity to help the cause. He was being an armchair activist, and that is not virtuous. So to come full circle, it is not virtuous to be generous with other people's resources, because in doing so, you are getting the benefits of being generous without expending any of the cost of being generous. And this disconnect is going to lead to malinvestment, whether it be by an armchair activist or by the government. And you should be extremely skeptical about someone who advocates for a cause by asking you to expend your own resources in furtherance of it, or who lobbies the government to use force to expend other people's resources in furtherance of this cause, but who is not willing to expend any of his own resources on it. Now you know my opinion, but what do you think? Please leave your take in the comments section. Otherwise, I really appreciate that you took the time to consider this matter, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye now.